Hello and welcome to my weekly podcast, Through the Bible in 10 Years. Well, I'm going to um, frustrate you again. Happy New Year's. This is my first podcast of 2022. And I preached a sermon this morning at a Wesleyan church on Genesis 1 as installing God as the King of the universe at the beginning of the new year. And I thought, why not? I thought I would go ahead and do explanatory notes on Genesis 1 this week. Now, this is my first explanatory note on something in the Old Testament. I've been doing pieces of the New Testament, and I intend to go back next week. My plan is currently to go back and finish up Hebrews next week. I am trying to write these up. One of my New Year's resolution is to speed up the pace of writing these up. So I've done Matthew the last 2 weeks, and I have on my blog blogged the explanatory notes, the written version of these podcasts on my blog, which is kenshank.blogspot.com. So if I do what I plan to do, I will write up the notes on the explanatory notes of Genesis 1 and post them on my blog. Of course, if you're listening to the podcast version of this, you're probably on Patreon. One of my New Year's resolutions is to start a less detailed podcast. So this podcast has been verse by verse and therefore very exegetical, and they tend to be very long, usually 35 to 45 minutes. Sometimes they've gone over an hour. And so I want to do a shorter 20-minute podcast each week, probably dropping that podcast at noon on Fridays, and I'm calling it The Bible and Other Things. So again, nobody's paying me to do this, really. I am getting money a little bit. I get a pittance from YouTube and from Patreon. But so I hope you don't mind if I kind of go where I want to go. Maybe it's the spirit. Probably it's just, the burrito I had for lunch. But on Friday, my current plan is to do a 20-minute version of what I'm about to do in more detail. And because I'm going to have this more popular, as it were, podcast on Fridays, if I keep up with it, I think I'm going to feel free to dive a little bit more into the original languages in the video version. So those, and I think I may on Patreon especially put that. I may put that behind the paywall. I don't know. In any case, it'll be here free on YouTube if you're watching the video version. Well, there's a lot of preface. Let's go then to Genesis 1. Why Genesis 1, you ask? What does that have to do with the new year? Well, I jokingly said in my sermon this morning that I think it's 37% of all New Year's resolutions run out the first week of January. And I know a lot of Christians have as their New Year's resolution to read through the whole Bible. That may fail after a few weeks or a few days even, but I'm pretty sure that there's a high success rate of getting through Genesis 1. And so this, of course, is completely coincidental, or is it? But there's a good chance that there are a lot of people who've read Genesis 1 even by the second day of January, which is when I'm doing this video podcast. So there's a good chance you've read it at the beginning of the year. John Walton, who is a professor at Wheaton, has written a book called The Lost World of Genesis 1. And he makes, it's not his main argument, but he drops a interesting suggestion that I'm not sure whether we could prove it. I mean, it's not implausible. It's not crazy. It's just I'm not sure that we have sufficient evidence to demonstrate anything like this. It seems to me to be the kind of claim that could be neither proven nor disproven. But he throws out there at one point in his book that perhaps Genesis 1 was read every year at a New Year's festival, and that the original context of Genesis 1, as it were, is the yearly installation of Yahweh as king of the cosmos, as king of the heavens, and as king of Israel. these kind of rituals, I think, are effective for us as human beings. I mean, why do we set New Year's resolutions, right? Why do we do it? When I think, what is it? Only 5%? I forget the percentage of New Year's resolutions that actually are completely kept. I think maybe 80% keep some part of it. I'm trying to remember the stats. I was looking up the stats this week. But we all know that there's a high failure rate on individual resolutions, a very high failure rate. Why do we do it? Well, imagine if we didn't. Then if we didn't reset these resolutions, put it this way. Let's say that my resolution is I want to eat well. I'm going to eat better this year. I'm going to eat more healthily this year. Let's say that I only make it 3 weeks out of the year. Well, isn't that 3 weeks better than no weeks? Isn't it better to eat well and to eat healthily for 1 month out of the year than for me not to eat ever well? I have no problem with setting New Year's resolutions, even though we often don't keep them, because it allows us to refocus on what's important to us. It helps us look at where we're at. It lets us take our temperature, and it lets us say, what do we want to be? In a perfect world, what would we be like? So I do not in any way have a problem with New Year's resolution. And so it makes fine sense to me that Israel would have had on Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. Rosh Hashanah is the new year for Jews. For the Jews to have a yearly festival in which they reinstalled Yahweh as king. And there is this interesting comment in the book of Judges. I find it interesting, and I hope that by the time I do Judges, that I will feel like I can just give you my straightforward musings, because I'm getting on in my years. I'm 55. That's not too old, is it? But and I probably have the freedom to muse more. But I feel like there is a sense in which a lot of times religion asks us to turn our brains off. And of course, it's very difficult for me to turn my brain off. What I do instead is turn my mouth off. I just don't talk about the passing thoughts that go through my head that much. It's actually not healthy for me to do that, because I like to talk. But it seems to be important. And so I hope that by the time I get to Judges, whenever that is in the next 10 years, that I will feel the freedom to muse. But Judges talks about a annual festival of Yahweh. This is in the later chapters of Judges, because it's the instance where the Benjamites are slaughtered, and so the surviving men of Benjamin don't have wives. And so the way that they get wives, and the other Israelites have taken a vow not to give any of their wives to the children of Benjamin, sons of Benjamin. So what they do, it's a little questionable what they do. What they do is, we're just not going to stop you from taking women at the annual festival of Yahweh. And so the Benjamites hide in the fields, and they abduct the women and take them as their wives. This is a strange story, but the book of Judges is full of strange stories, isn't it? But it mentions the annual festival of Yahweh, and we're left thinking, what is that? Because there are like 3 festivals in Leviticus, where there's the Day of Atonement, there's the Pentecost, there's the Feast of Tabernacles. What's the yearly festival of Yahweh in Judges? And my inkling is, and I don't think this is a crazy inkling at all, my sense is that Judges gives us some of the earliest material of the Old Testament, or shall I put it this way, some of the least edited material of the Old Testament. That we get peaks, and one of the reasons why the book of Judges is so strange is because it gives us a peek into the unedited history of Israel a long time ago, before 1000 BC. But this annual festival of Yahweh, could it have been a New Year festival? Could it have been a festival where they installed Yahweh as king again? Now, Walton doesn't go into anything like that. These are just the musings of my warped and twisted imagination. I cannot prove or disprove that Genesis 1 was some kind of a liturgy for the yearly enthronement of Yahweh as king of Israel. I can't prove or disprove that. It is an interesting hypothesis, and I'll talk a little bit Friday in my new podcast about kind of the general contours of that. And in terms of Genesis 1 in relation to the rest of the Pentateuch, I would not be saying anything particularly novel if I suggested that a lot of scholars think that Genesis 1 may have been one of the last bits that was added to the Pentateuch. Now, there's no verse in the New Testament that says Moses wrote Genesis 1. Generally, Genesis 1 is lumped in with the rest of the Pentateuch when we talk about, the issues of who wrote the Pentateuch. Of course, there's not a verse in Genesis that says Moses is not named in Genesis. From an inductive standpoint, there is no reason to think that Moses wrote Genesis. There is maybe one or two places where the New Testament seems to operate on the assumption that Moses wrote Genesis. It's not very frequent. Most of the quoting of Moses is the quoting of Moses, right? Things that Moses says in the Pentateuch. So I'm not going to get off into those things. Once I finally do my introduction to Genesis, no doubt when I do that, I will get into the questions of the sources behind Genesis. Is Moses the author? Those kinds of things. Those are all things way off in the future. I don't see me doing that in the next year or two. But I do want to do Genesis 1 today. And if Genesis 1 is a kind of introduction to the Pentateuch, as it were, it's often remarked that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are almost like the creation story in two different ways. There's a different order, for example. Genesis 2 says that Adam was created when there was no plant yet on the land, whereas in Genesis 1, the plants are created several days before. In fact, the plants are created before the stars, before the sun, before the moon are created. The plants are created on day 3, and the stars and the sun and the moon are created on day 4. Light is created on day 1, of course. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, perhaps, but Genesis 1 is an introduction. When would that be? Well, my sense is that would probably be added in the, and again, I'm not saying anything that's particularly unique. This is not my area of expertise. This is just what I think the majority of scholars would say. The Genesis 1 was probably added to the collection in its final stages of editing in the 400s BC, I would guess. You could argue for the 500s BC, late 500s BC perhaps. But here's what I'm getting at there. What creation stories is Genesis 1 in dialogue with? Because remember, Genesis 1 is written for Israel. And so what are the competing creation narratives at the time? What else is in the water? Well, the Enuma Elish would be an example of something in the water. In the Enuma Elish, the gods fight. There's only one God in Genesis 1. That's one of the key takeaways from Genesis 1, is that there's only one God involved, and that one God, what God says happens. And God said, and it's done. That's very noticeable. There's all this fight, Marduk versus Tiamat in the Enuma Elish, or however you want to say it. And Marduk wins, and Marduk takes Tiamat, that is the saltwater goddess. He breaks her in half, takes some of her waters and puts them up in the sky, takes some of her waters and puts them down on the land. Does this sound familiar? A verse that we're going to see in a second, where God separates the waters from the waters, some waters above the dome, some waters under the dome. The Israelite would have been struck, I think, by the fact that there's only one God involved here. Some of the similarities between the Enuma Elish and the creation story in Genesis 1 is, of course, it starts off with water. In verse 2, we have the waters. And it doesn't exactly say where the waters came from, which is something that we'll talk about in a second. Genesis 1 is a story of God taking chaos and ordering it. And so I think the other striking, so the singleness of God, that there's only one God, and that what God says goes in Genesis 1, and God doesn't have to create anything. That's one of the features that we notice immediately in Genesis 1. The other feature, I think, is the ordering. That Genesis 1 is the ordering of chaos. Genesis 1 is God whipping the world, whipping the universe into shape, getting it into working order. That's what Genesis 1 is about. And John Walton suggests that this chapter might have been read at a yearly festival of Yahweh, maybe a New Year's festival of Yahweh, in which the chaos of the world was put into order. That this is a liturgy, that this is the enactment of the installation of Yahweh as king again for yet another year. The world may be chaos, everything may be going to pot, but we're going to install Yahweh as king of the universe. And the world, now this is Walton argues this. I don't know, I'm not entirely convinced, although this is very plausible. The ancients did tend to view the world as God's temple. So the earthly temples were, as it were, imitations, models, miniatures of the universe temple, the cosmos temple, that God inhabited. And so Walton argues that any Israelite hearing Genesis 1 is going to hear that God's temple is being built. This is the building of God's temple. And so when God rests on the seventh day, Walton argues, he is basically now going to take over residence in his palace. He is going to take over residence in his temple. He is now going to begin, he's built the house, now he's going to begin to rule in his house. And so this yearly liturgy in Walton's hypothesis is the installation of Yahweh as king yet again for this next year. Okay, there's a little bit of background, and with that background in mind, let's go ahead and start with Genesis 1 and verse 1. So let's go ahead and begin. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We all know that verse, don't we? Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Now, in the beginning is an interesting word here. There's no the there. Some have translated it as when God began to create the heavens and the earth. It is very interesting because is this an absolute statement, or do we need to connect verse 1 with verse 2? I think probably in its original context, verses 1 and verse 2 need to be to be connected. So that the original sense that is in ancient Israel, the way that they would have taken this in ancient Israel, is something like this. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was tohu vavohu. It was formless and void. It was functional. It was non-functional. It was a mess. And darkness was over the face of the deep, the tehom, and the Spirit of God, the Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God was hovering, was blowing, the wind of God was blowing over the face of the waters. Now, creation hasn't started yet, has it? And God said, let there be light. Creation starts on day 3. The water is already there, as it was in the other creation stories. Now, that's what I would say is probably the dominant way to interpret this, especially since it would seem that creation ex nihilo, that is creation out of nothing, just simply wasn't a concept that anyone was thinking or discussing until even after Jesus. That creation ex nihilo really is a doctrine that was reformed in the 2nd century during the Gnostic controversy. The Gnostic controversy, of course, Gnostics believed that matter was evil, and they believed that matter was eternal. And so the Christian response was, no, God made everything. God made matter as well as spirit. And that's what Christians have believed ever since. That's what Jews officially believe. That's what I believe, by the way. I believe that God created the world out of nothing. I believe that God, in fact, created the world out of not even emptiness, that space itself is a creation. Emptiness is a creation. I don't even know what that means to say that God created the universe out of empty set, not even nothing, not even zero. God created the zero in which everything is. That's what I believe. I believe that very, very strongly. It is part of the wondrousness of creation for me. Is that what Genesis 1 was thinking? I doubt it, because that was just simply not a concept. Now, Walton argues that one of the barriers to us understanding Genesis 1 is that we tend to think of this from a modern scientific standpoint, that is a material standpoint. That when we read this, we are thinking about the creation of materials. And what Walton would say is that it's not really about the creation of materials. That could be implied, but that what's really, Genesis 1 is really about getting the world in order. It's about getting the materials to work. That when Genesis begins, the materials are tohu vavohu. The materials are formless and void. The materials are non-functional when God begins to create. The waters are chaos. And of course, waters in the ancient world were not viewed, when I think of waters, I think let's go swimming. But when the ancients thought of waters, they tended to think of the chaos monster, of Leviathan, of sea monsters, of that which threatens. Water was not seen as a particularly positive thing. And of course, there are all kinds of ancient traditions about the flood. I'm sure there are more now. At one time, I'd heard that there were 88 different traditions about a worldwide flood that are circulating in different cultures around the globe. Water was not viewed as a positive thing, and in fact, part of the flood is God releasing the waters that He's about to store up here in chapter 1, and so it begins with chaos, and God is about to create order out of the chaos of the world. It starts with darkness. There's no light when it starts. You just have the spirit, the wind from God, and the word for spirit and wind are closely related in Hebrew. You have this wind blowing over the waters, and that's kind of the starting point here. Walton would say it's not asking about where the waters came from. That's just not the question that Genesis 1 is even asking. There's one other thing that I was going to say here. What was it? I'm blanking. Let me see if I can pause this and catch my thought. Okay, I remember what it was. Some of the old timers, like my grandfather, I had a professor in college who believed in something called the gap theory. They saw a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. They were trying to ask the question, how can everything be tohu vavohu in verse 2 if God created everything in verse 1? There's actually a verse, I think it's in Isaiah, that said that God did not create the world as a tohu vavohu, but He created it to be inhabited. And so what they concluded is something must have happened between Genesis 1 and Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Maybe Satan fell, and when Satan fell, everything got disorderly. That was the gap theory, the idea that there's a gap between 1:1 and 1:2. Of course, some of the early, like in the late 1800s, when evolution first came out, there were some people who tried to maybe stick evolution or the dinosaurs in between 1:1 and 1:2 to try to, because the initial response of Christians to evolution was to try to find some way to harmonize the two, because science and faith had gotten along so well from the 1600s all the way to the 1800s. So the gap theory, I don't see any evidence for anything like that. Satan actually is not mentioned in most of the Old Testament. Satan is not a category in Genesis. I know we believe, and I believe, that the serpent was Satan, but Genesis doesn't seem to know that. Genesis never mentions Satan. Satan is never mentioned in any of the Pentateuch. Satan is mentioned in 3 books of the Old Testament, in Job, in Zechariah, and in 1 Chronicles, all of which I would argue are relatively late books in the formation of the Old Testament. Well, so Genesis 1, 1, and 2 is the situation that we find the world in when God comes. You can see that the way I'm not reading this as a kind of a videotape of creation. I'm reading this as a creation story that is meant to tell us truths about God vis-a-vis the other creation stories of the day. And of course, that it may very well be very symbolic if it's a liturgy. If it's a liturgy, as John Walton thinks, then it is a very symbolic kind of thing, that it's not in any way trying to give us a videotape, but what it is doing, it is a reenactment of creation, as it were, to install Yahweh, to create order out of chaos, and to install Yahweh as king of the cosmos. Well, so let's go on. Now the creation begins with verse 3. Now we're going to start creation. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Notice, God says it, and it's done. There's no negotiating with other gods. There's no fighting with other gods. There's just God says it, and it happens. That would have been very noticeable, I think, to any of the original audiences of Genesis 1. Notice that light is created before the sun or the moon or the stars. This has often puzzled people. A lot of people take it as a hint or an indication that Genesis 1 is meant to be read more as poetry than as anything like a blow-by-blow accounts. Of course, you can fit it into modern cosmology if you want, because photons existed before any sun, right? What is sometimes called the Big Bang originally was about the release of light in the early universe. And so let there be light. This actually fits very well with modern scientific understandings of how things unfolded long before there was any star or sun. I think it would be quite out of context to read Genesis 1 that way. There's no ancient Israelite that thought of it that way. And Walton has argued here, I keep going back to Walton, that the purpose of light here is to set up time. Because, let me go ahead and read verse 4. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light and the darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. So what Walton argues is that the creation of light here is the creation of time. That's what we're talking about here. The Jews did not have clocks. They did not have wristwatches. They did not have cell phones to tell them the time. The way that they told time was by day and night. And as you can see here, there was evening, then there was morning. The Jewish day begins at sundown. And so the world began in darkness, and God created light. And thus the Jewish day begins in darkness and ends in light. And that's the pattern of day and night here. And Walton also says that good here is not about moral goodness, that we're reading Genesis out of context in terms of our preconceptions if we think that this is talking about morally good. That good here is more like, we're good to go. Okay, try the engine now, we're good. It's whether things are working. That light is good, that time is working. After God separates the darkness from the light, time is working. We can now have day, night, night, day, night, day, night, day, night, day, night, day. We can now have the forward motion of time because God has created light, and it's now it's working. Now we've got time working. So that Genesis 1, or the day 1 of creation here, is more about the creation of time than it is the creation of photons or anything like that. But we're creating goodness and order. Everything was dark, and that's not good. Now there's light, and that's good. Second day, verse 6. And God said, "Let there be a rakia, let there be a dome or a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it be as a division between the waters and the waters." So we've got chaos water everywhere. Water, 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 water. What God does first is God separates the upper waters from the lower waters, and he puts a dome in there, a firmament, and now we have sky. And so he's created a space. He's created a space of for things to be. I don't know if you know anybody who's a hoarder, or is on a borderline hoarder, but you can't find anything, you can't get to anything because there's so much clutter that you can't even move around, And so God is taking the clutter and the chaos of the water, and he's created a space. He's created a dome to restrain the waters above. Now, of course, these waters will come down during the flood, but he's created sky by putting a dome, a vault, a firmament up above the sky, so that we can now have safety from those chaotic waters above. So he's created a space, and this allows, of course, for seasons and for weather and so forth. So verse 7. So, and God made the dome, and he divided between the waters that were under the firmament and the waters that were above the firmament, and it was so. Vayihi, and it was so. Verse 8. And God called the firmament sky. There was evening and there was morning the second day. So he created a space in the sky by dividing the upper waters from the lower waters. Day 3, verse 9. And God said, let the waters under the skies be gathered together into one place, and let dry ground appear, and it was so. So he's created, on day 2, he creates a space between the waters in the sky. Now he's creating a space between the waters on the land, and now dry land appears. So we've got the waters on the edges of the world. By the way, I'm trying to give you a somewhat literal reading of this here. It's not a universe with lots of solar systems and galaxies and so forth, right? This was written for ancient Israel, right? This was written to speak messages to ancient Israel. It was not written to answer all of our questions about the cosmology of the universe. This isn't even really our solar system. This is just a relatively flat Earth, and you go straight up, and as you go straight up, there's a dome and there are waters, and that's the extent of the universe here in Genesis 1. And there's land, and then on the edges of the land there are seas. There's not even under the earth here. There's no under the earth in Genesis 1. It is land, seas on the edges, you go straight up, dome, and then waters above, with the sky between the dome and the earth. So this is a very, very small picture. The universe, as we now think the universe is very, very, very much bigger than this. I'm not, by the way, and I want you to hear me here, I'm not finding any fault whatsoever with Genesis. There's nothing wrong with Genesis. Nothing wrong with Genesis at all. This is a beautiful passage. I think we get preoccupied with things that Genesis isn't even addressing a lot of times in our debates. We get all bent out of shape over things that it's not even on Genesis's mind. What I'm trying to stick to the more literal sense of what Genesis is actually talking about here. So day 1, God turns on the lights. Day 2, God holds the waters of the sky back by putting a dome, and then we have sky. And then on day 3, he creates a space on the waters on the bottom, and pushes the waters to the edges, and then the land appears. And that's day 3. Wait a minute. Have we gotten to day 3 yet? Yeah, we already saw day 2. Yeah, okay. We're on day 3. God's created the dry ground. He's let the dry ground appear. Okay, verse 10. And God called the dry land earth, or land. Actually, land and sky would be a far more appropriate translation than heavens and earth, because when we hear earth, we immediately think globe. And the word eretz simply means land. And the word shemayim doesn't mean heaven in the way that I think of when we all get to heaven. It's skies. It's simply the word for skies. So God called the dry land land, and the collection of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Everything's working here. Seas are in their place. Sky's in its place. It's good. Everything's working. We're good. Verse 11. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass and herb that yields seed, tree yielding fruit, or fruit tree yielding fruit tree, according to its kind, whose seed is in itself, and on the land, and it was so. So we're still on day 3. God not only creates the dry land, but he creates the trees. Now, of course, as we now would think of the sun as being essential for photosynthesis in plants. Again, I don't think we're asking the wrong questions when we get off into those kinds of things. Genesis 1 is not a literal picture of creation. It's a poetic picture of creation that is meaning to speak to other creation stories and to express the worldview of ancient Israel in terms of kinds of things. It's not a science narrative of exactly how it happened. I think we're reading it wrong, and we're setting ourselves up for crisis if we read it that way. There are trees here before there's a sun, and that's okay, because this is working within the ancient Israelite worldview. The truths are presented in the clothing. The truth is not the clothing. The truth is what's inside the clothing. What's inside the clothing is that there's one God, that what God says goes, that there's no conflict, and that God creates order out of chaos. God creates things that work out of things that don't work. So the earth brings forth the grass, the herb, bearing seeds according to its kind, the tree yielding fruit, whose seed is in itself. And God saw that it was good. Verse 13, there was evening, there was morning, the third day. Okay, so day 1, God turns on the lights. Day 2, he creates a sky and a dome that holds back the waters above. Day 3, he separates the waters below, creates dry ground, and creates plants, all kinds of plants on day 3. Now, what John Walton would say is that on days 1, 2, and 3, God creates the functions. He creates the function of time when he creates light. He creates the function of seasons when he separates the waters in the sky. On day 3, Walton would say he creates agriculture. He creates food on day 3. So what Walton would then say is, if the first 3 days of creation create the functions, then in the last 3 days of creation, God creates the functionaries. That is, the ruling bodies of each function. So again, this is not therefore to be taken as a temporal necessarily sequence, but more of a logical kind of sequence. In the first 3 days, he's created the basic functions of reality. Now he's creating the rulers of those functions in the next 3 days. Verse 14, and God said, let there be lights in the dome of the skies to divide between the day and between the night. Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be for lights in the dome of the sky to shine upon the land. And it was so. And verse 16, and God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. And he made the stars. And God set them in the dome of the sky to shine upon the earth and to rule over the day and over the night and to divide between the light and between the darkness. And God saw, we're good, everything's working. God saw that it was good. Verse 19, and there was evening and there was morning the 4th day. Now, you might say, did not the ancient Israelites, did not the author of Genesis realize that you needed a sun in order to have light? And I think there's a fair chance that the answer would be yes. The author of Genesis 1 understood that. But that's not what they were doing. That this is a poetic presentation of the creation. And so it didn't bother the author for it to not be in chronological order, for example. That this is much more poetic. But the sun and the stars are the functionaries that rule the function. So if the function is day and night, if the function is time, and the function is light, then the functionaries are the stars and the sun and the moon. That we get in verse 4 the leaders of the function of time, the leaders of the function of light. And we today would say, well, that's in the wrong order. First you get the sun and then you get the light. But that's not the way. We're not writing this. This is not written to us originally. This is written to ancient Israel. This is written in the categories of ancient Israel. It's written in the forms that the thought forms of ancient Israel. And in that case, it's no problem for the sources of light to be in day 4 rather than in day 1. It's not a problem at all. Let me also say that if you follow, sometimes people make a big deal out of reading Genesis 1 literally. Well, a literal reading of this has the stars put in the dome. That is, if we read Genesis 1 literally, then the waters above, there are waters above the stars, and there are waters above the sun, and there are waters above the moon. Because remember, the dome holds back the waters that are above. And it says on day 4, the sun and the stars are put in the dome. The lights are in the dome, and the waters then would be above. So I think there's a lot of baggage in the reading of Genesis 1, and it clouds our mind, and we can't just listen to what it actually says. And what it actually says is that the lights are in the dome and the waters are above it. Again, I'm trying to say that we're just off track in reading it. This is about God being sovereign. This is about the other gods of the world not being true gods. This is about God creating order out of chaos. And we get off into these side debates, and we de-Christianize people over their positions on these sorts of things. When I think Moses, ancient Israel, whoever you want to say, they would look at us and say, what are you talking about? What in the world are you talking about? What you're saying I don't even understand what you're saying, the author of Genesis 1 might say. What you're saying has nothing to do with what we understood Genesis 1 to be. And of course, if John Walton's speculation is right, then this is a liturgy in which we're all here at the temple. We're here at the temple again, where we're going to reenact God's installation as King of the universe. God, once again, is going to take the tohu vavohu of the world, and God is going to whip it into shape, and God is going to create order. And by the time we're done, we are going to announce God and proclaim God as King of the world. And as we go into this new year, if that's what Genesis 1 is about, then how sidetracked are we with a lot of these debates that we have over, is it a day-age theory where each day is actually 1,000,000 years? A day is as 1,000 years. We get off into these things, or is it a parent age? God created the world to look like it's very old. It may very well be that those are so ridiculously off track in terms of how we should read Genesis 1 that it'd be funny if it wasn't funny because of the way we treat each other over these sorts of things. Well, day 4, God creates the lights, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Day 5, verse 20. And God said, let the waters teem with an abundance of living creatures. Nefesh kaya. By the way, nefesh is sometimes translated soul. I think that's probably not a good English translation for it, because these aren't fish with souls. But just a soul in the Old Testament, a nephesh in the Old Testament, is a living being. And it can be a fish, because it's talking here about the nefesh kaya, the living souls that are in the waters. That's not translated soul, living beings that are in the waters. So with an abundance of living creatures, let the birds fly above the earth, across the face of the dome. Verse 21, so God created the great sea creatures like Leviathan, and every nefesh kaya, every living thing that moves, that the waters abounded according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. God saw that it was good. We're good. Everything's working here. Everything's good. We've put it in order. We've beat the chaos back, and now there's order. Verse 22, and God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters and the seas, let the birds multiply on the earth. Verse 23, and there was evening and there was morning, the 5th day. So on day 2, God creates the function of weather. God creates the function of seasons. God creates the expanse of the sky. He puts a dome to hold back the waters. Now on day 5, God is going to create the functionaries in the sky and in the waters at the edges. So he puts the birds in the sky. That he created the sky on day 2. Now he's populating the sky with the birds, and he's populating the seas on the edges of the land. He's putting fishes and things like that into the seas. So he's populating the skies and the seas on the edges of the world on day 5. And so these are the creatures that inhabit these edges of the universe in the sky and on the edges of the sea. 6th day. So now we finally get to the creatures on the land. And of course, this is the climax. We're getting to the climax. The climax of the story is, of course, the creation of humanity. And so, verse 24, and God said, let the land bring forth every living creature according to its kind, livestock and creeping thing and beast of the land according to its kind, and it was so. By the way, this, I call it kind theology, this creation of things according to their kind. We're going to find this same worldview perspective when we one day get to Leviticus, because the clean and unclean animals of Leviticus are based upon, I would argue, following Mary Douglas, that the clean and unclean animals have a lot to do with this sense of what the kinds of things are. That there are certain kinds of things that are clean, and there are certain kinds of things that are unclean. And the dynamic of clean and unclean has a lot to do with whether or not things fit in the box of its kind. So like things that slither on the ground, they don't fit ground stuff. They don't fit their kind, because things that are on the ground should walk in some way. And so one day, it'll be years from now probably, before we get to Leviticus. But when we get to Leviticus, Lord willing, we'll talk a little bit about this, what I call kind theology. Not, oh, you're so kind, not that kind of kind, but kinds of things. Priestly kind theology in the Pentateuch. All right, verse 25. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, and livestock, the behemah, the livestock according to its kind, everything that creeps on the land according to its kind. And God saw, we're good. God saw that it's good. Everything's working. Put a little oil over here. Okay, everything's in order now. We've got the land populated. The ground is the way that it's supposed to be. And now we get to the climax of the creation with verse 26. And God said, let us make human in our image, according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the livestock, and over all the land, and over everything creeping thing that creeps upon the land. Okay, who's the us? Let us. Who is the us? Well, of course, we as Christians are wont to see the Trinity here, and of course, maybe God kind of implanted that into the narrative. But of course, no Israelite knew about the Trinity. The Trinity wasn't ironed out until the 300s and 400s after Christ. So there's certainly no Israelite that understood the Trinity here. We don't want. I mean, I doubt that Moses. Moses writes Genesis 1, and you think, well, why is God inspiring me to say, let us make? I mean, there would have been something in the bubble above the author of Genesis 1's head. What was in that bubble? Well, we do know that there is a sense of there being heavenly hosts. So that's one possibility, that God is speaking to the angels. There are angels in Genesis, for example. There are other, we would not call them gods, but there were other spiritual beings in the Old Testament, right? The armies of the Lord. There's more with us than be with them. When Elisha opens his servant's eyes so that he can see the heavenly armies. I mean, the Lord is the Lord of hosts, right? The Lord of Zabaoth, the Lord of armies. And so there is that possibility. If you read Psalm 82, we have an interesting picture, again, I don't take it literally, of God speaking to the gods of the other nations. It's kind of a Clash of the Titans, Perseus, Zeus talking to the other gods picture, except it's Yahweh talking to the gods of the other nations. And he says, you all may be gods, but you're going down because you've not treated your people right. So there could be a sense of God speaking to all the heavenly beings, whoever they might be, which, by the way, Genesis doesn't talk about their creation. Genesis simply doesn't ask or answer that question of where the other heavenly beings came from. Of course, we as Christians believe that God created everything. And the Nicene Creed made this very clear as they worked out these controversies. The Nicene Creed says that God is not only the creator, the Apostles' Creed says, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. The Nicene Creed goes on to say, creator of all that is seen and unseen, making it very clear that the angels weren't just around from all eternity. Demons weren't just around from all eternity. But everything that exists, period, was created by God, including heavenly beings as well. So probably, my guess is that the Israelites would have understood this us to be a reference to other God speaking to other heavenly beings as well, that we would call angels and so forth. Of course, some of the Israelites probably did call them gods. Paul says there are lots of so-called gods, but for us there's just one. There is a perspective. You've heard of polytheism, the worship of many gods. Many would say that some Israelites were henotheists. A henotheist is somebody who believes there's only one legitimate God. There may be other spiritual beings out there, but there's only one true God. And of course, Paul does call the so-called gods at the temples of other gods, he calls them demons. So for Paul, at the Parthenon, in Athens, Paul would have seen the Parthenon as being demon-possessed. What others might call Athena or Aphrodite, he would see as a demon. And so it's possible that there were ancient Israelites that called some of those spiritual forces gods. We wouldn't call them gods. We would call them demons and so forth. Of course, another possibility is it's the plural of majesty. Let us make man. But again, I suspect, I can't prove it, but I suspect that what makes the most sense in ancient Israel is that this is God speaking to the other heavenly beings, angels and such. Let us make God in our image. I know, what, in the image of angels? Well, that maybe there is, of course, Psalm 8. What is humanity? You made them a little lower than God. Some translations, you made them a little lower than the angels. Well, anyway, certainly our takeaway here, one of our biggest takeaways theologically here, is that all human beings are intrinsically valuable because all human beings have been created in the image of God. And therefore we must treat all human beings with respect, even the dirty, no-good scoundrel ones, even the evil ones are deserving of a certain dignity. So I'm not going to argue for or against the capital punishment. I'm not going to argue for or against that. But even if someone were to be put to death by capital punishment, this would speak that there should be some dignity afforded to that person, because as evil as they may be, and C.S. Lewis would say this, no one can be entirely evil, not even Satan. And I think what Lewis would say is, and I think he's following Augustine a little bit here, what Lewis would say is that if someone was entirely evil, they would cease to exist entirely, because evil is the lack of existence. Evil is the absence of being. And so if a being were entirely evil, they would cease to exist. Now, that's a little too Platonic, or Neoplatonic probably, for my liking. But basically, what I'm arguing here is even a Hitler should probably be afforded some basic level respect, even if we're putting them in front of a firing squad, because all human beings have been created in the image of God. Of course, different theologians talk about different kinds of image of God. The moral image, we can reason right and wrong. The natural image, we can think. But what I think actually here, from the context here, the image of God here is what some have called the political image. That the image of God, as it's the perspective here in verse 26, is the dominion of humanity over the rest of the creation. That as God is sovereign over the creation, so humanity is being installed as the steward of the creation as well. Humanity has an authority in the same way that God has an authority. And so the focus here in 126 is on what we might call the political image of God. Verse 27, so God created the human in his image, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. So women are also created in the image of God. And I'm taking Adam here, the man, Ha-Adam, as a reference to the human, that this is not primarily focused on maleness, but it's focused on humanness. By the way, bara, vayivra, that this word that is used 3 times in Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then when God creates, I think it's the animals, he also baras. I don't remember where the second bara is, but the third bara is here, where God creates humanity. And some have argued that bara means creation out of nothing, but it does. I don't think that was even in the vocabulary bank of ancient Israel. But there is something different about the bara creation and the asa creation. So asa is God doing things, but bara is it's a higher level kind of creation, I would say. I'll just leave that here. Verse 28, and God blessed them, and he said to them, be fruitful. God said to them, be fruitful, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish, over the birds of the air, over every living thing that moves upon the land. Now, this is not a license to destroy. I mean, this is not, go mess up the place. I mean, that wouldn't make any sense, would it? For God to say, here, I've created this beautiful place. Go completely burn it to the ground. And so most people see in this command a command to be a steward of what God has given. We are tenants, as it were. We're taking care of God's stuff. And because we're talking about God here, we want to take good care of God's stuff. So if anybody, and I guess there have been some in the past who've taken that as let's pollute it. It doesn't matter. I think that's a mischaracterization of what God is. He's not talking about, let's go cut down every tree everywhere in the world and not replenish them. That doesn't seem to be the spirit of what's going on here. Verse 29, and God said, behold, I have given to you every herb that yields seed that is on the face of the land, and every tree that is the fruit yielding tree, it shall be, its seed shall be to you for food. Verse 30, I've given you every beast of the earth, every bird, and to everything that creeps upon the earth, in which the life is in it. Every green food I've given for food, and it was so. Actually, to every beast he's given them. So everything seems to be vegetarian here. This is something that is very interesting about Genesis, that humans and animals are all vegetarian, it would seem, until after the flood. And then it's a carnivore's kind of land. But at this point of existence, it would seem that we're all vegetarians. And the beasts, even the birds and the beasts of the earth are all vegetarians at this point. Verse 31, and God saw all that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So now we have tov ma'od. It's not just good. We're good. It's very good. Everything is written. Everything now is done. Everything is working in its completeness and its fullness. Everything is now the way that we want it to be. And it was evening and it was morning, the 6th day. So those are the 6 days of creation, but I don't want to stop there because the chapter divisions were, of course, added in the 1200s. And actually, this part of Genesis, the introduction to Genesis, goes all the way through verse 3, I believe. And so here we have at chapter 2, verse 1, the kind of summary statement. Thus were finished the skies and the land and all of their host. So God has created order out of everything. In the beginning, God created the skies and the earth. Now it's done. The skies and the earth are done. Verse 2, and God ended on the 7th day his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. It's done. The temple is built. He has built the temple of the universe, and now it's time for him to stop building and for him to get in the temple and start ruling. And so in Walton's way of thinking about it, when you build a house, you don't build the house and then just go in and sit on the couch and watch reruns of Friends, and drink lots of Mountain Dew and eat potato chips. That why have you built the house? You've built the house to live in it. And so God ceasing from his work on the seventh day is him ceasing from his work of creation. But now he's going to live in it. Now he's going to live in this temple. Now he's going to live in this universe. Now he's going to go forward. There's going to be a day 8, and now there's going to be God's sovereignty over the world. And in the way that Walton would see this as a yearly festival, I think, and I welcome him to come out of the abyss of the internet and to speak correction to me or anyone who knows if I've gotten anything wrong here. But the way I understand it is that now God is going to rule from his temple. God has built the temple of the universe. We've had this liturgy on the first of the year to install Yahweh in the universe, and now let him rule. Now let God has created order out of chaos, and now let's begin the year. Let's have another year with Yahweh as king. Let's have another year in which God rules, in which we worship God in his temple. Let the year begin. This is the year of the Lord. Yahweh is king. So verse 3, and so God blessed the seventh day, and he set it apart as holy. He sanctified it because on it he rested from the work that God had created and accomplished. The work that he had bara. And so this is, of course, the origin reason for the Jews not working on the Sabbath. 6 days you will labor, and on the seventh day you will rest. And so in that sense, every Saturday, because of course from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday was the Jewish Sabbath. On Saturday, as it were, is another reminder that God is in his temple. Every Sabbath is another reminder that God has created this order out of the universe. Every day of the week is leading toward God resting again. And in a sense, we can think of us as Christians, us installing God as king every week. We, of course, also we worship on Sunday to remember the Easter, the resurrection, to remember Easter, to remember the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. But why not? Why would we not also remember every Saturday, Sunday, as it were, as the resting of God from his work of creation, and to reinstall him for the new week as king of his temple and king of the world and the universe? Well, I may be wrong on some things in this video. I do not claim to be inspired or inerrant, but hopefully you found something in this talk on Genesis 1 that is meaningful to you, and I welcome any pushback you might want to give on YouTube or on Patreon, where I locate my podcast. Well, may you have a wonderful week. This has been Through the Bible in 10 Years.